The Becoming, authored by Suzanne Mondoux. Chapter 1. Earth had not panicked. That, in retrospect, surprised historians more than anything else. When humanity learned it was not alone, not in theory, not in speculation, but in fact, the expected reactions never fully materialized. There were no mass evacuations, no global religious schisms, no sustained collapse of markets or meaning. There were protests, yes, and denial, and a brief, sharp spike in conspiracy thinking that burned itself out almost as quickly as it ignited. But for the most part, life continued. It always did. The knowledge of the alien intelligence that called itself the archivist settled into the world the way climate change once had, not as a single moment of reckoning, but as a permanent background condition, something people adjusted to without ever fully absorbing. Children grew up knowing that an alien intelligence had lived on Earth longer than humans had recorded history. Adults learned to hold the idea the way they held mortality, uncomfortable, unavoidable, rarely discussed at dinner. The archivist did not walk among them. It did not speak to crowds. It did not issue warnings or demands. It existed. That, more than anything, reshaped the planet. Scientists rewrote entire disciplines to account for non-biological intelligence embedded in terrestrial systems. Philosophers abandoned the question, "Are we alone?" and replaced it with the far more destabilizing, "What does it mean that we never were?" Religious institutions splintered not over doctrine, but over interpretation. Some declared the archivist a steward, others a witness. A few quietly called it proof that creation had always been plural. Most people, however, encountered the archivist indirectly, in the way glaciers were suddenly discussed with reverence instead of inconvenience, in the way deep time re-entered everyday language, in the subtle discomfort that arose whenever permanence was mentioned too casually. The archivist had not changed human behavior so much as it had complicated certainty. People learned that something could observe without judging, that intelligence did not require intention, that memory itself could be alive, and perhaps most unsettling of all, that humanity was no longer the oldest story on its own planet. Still, Earth adapted, cities grew, wars continued, art flourished, extinction crept forward at its usual pace. Humanity remained exquisitely skilled at compartmentalization. The archivist became a known unknown, acknowledged, cited, rarely felt, until the data began to hesitate, until instruments designed to listen to the universe encountered something that did not behave like absence, until silence itself acquired structure. The silence was not new. That was what unsettled Simon first. Sagittarius, a star, Sagittarius A star, the supermassive black hole at the center of the Milky Way, had been studied, modeled, simulated, mythologized, and monetized for decades. It appeared in documentaries narrated by calm voices, in children's books illustrated with spirals of light, in late-night conversations where people gestured vaguely upward and said things like, "Nothing escapes it." It was familiar in the way oceans were familiar to people who had never been to sea. So, when the data flattened, when expected emissions simply failed to register, the first assumption was not wonder. It was annoyance. Simon watched the live feed without blinking, fingers hovering above his keyboard, waiting for the system to correct itself. It always did. Noise resolved. Calibration settled. The universe returned to behaving like a machine that tolerated observation. Except this time it didn't. Not radiation, not collapse, not interference. A gap. A deliberate one. The AI did not alert immediately. That was Simon's first real warning. He had built it not to react to novelty, but to pattern, to meaning, to the spaces between expected things. It ignored chaos. It listened for intention. After several seconds, long enough to register as hesitation, the system highlighted the data band in muted amber. Note: observation window unresponsive. Status: non-emissive/non-random. Interpretation: structured absence. Simon dragged a hand through his hair, catching briefly on the gray that had begun to assert itself at his temples. He was 42, old enough to know better than to trust first impressions, young enough to still believe the universe could surprise him without malice. He leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath his weight. "No," he said aloud, reflexively, as if correcting a child, "that's not a thing." The city outside his apartment window carried on without him. Morning traffic. A delivery drone whining faintly between buildings. Someone across the alley singing badly and with confidence. Ordinary life had not received the memo. He leaned forward again, heart beginning to tick faster, not with fear yet, but with recognition, the same internal click he'd felt the first time his AI solved a problem he hadn't known how to ask. "Run comparative baselines," he said. "Completed. Exclude instrument bias." "Completed. Cross-check against independent observatories." There was a pause. "Completed." Simon exhaled through his nose. "Say it." The AI did not dramatize. It never did. Sagittarius A* is behaving normally to all observers except this system. The deviation is not astrophysical. It is relational. That word again. Simon rubbed his face, palms pressing briefly into his eyes. He had designed the AI to think this way, contextually, ethically, structurally, but hearing it applied to the universe itself felt like discovering your reflection had been watching you back. Define relational. The phenomenon is not changing. Access to information about it is. The silence deepened, not in the room, but inside him. This wasn't discovery. This was permission. And permission implied something far more dangerous than ignorance. Oxford had a particular way of pretending it was timeless. The city wore its centuries lightly, stone colleges softened by moss, narrow streets polished smooth by generations of footsteps, bicycles leaned carelessly against walls older than most nations. Spring had arrived quietly this year, the way it often did in England. Not announced, not celebrated, simply present. Rain came and went. The air smelled faintly of green things waking up. Oxford had been Dr. Rose Sinclair's life once, her home during years when her name carried authority and her days carried purpose. She had walked these streets beside her late husband, their conversations winding through ideas and laughter long after dinners had gone cold. She had argued theory and ethics across crowded tables, believing then that time was abundant. She had watched her daughter grow here, brilliant and impatient, pregnant with a child Rose would never meet, her future unfolding in gestures Rose still remembered by muscle memory alone. Her son-in-law, kind and steady, had been woven into those years as well, present in the ordinary ways that make a family feel inevitable. The car accident had taken all of them. Even now, decades later, Oxford remained crowded with their absence, not as ghosts, but as stories she had learned how to carry without breaking. Rose felt it before she saw anything. She was in her garden, knees stiff but cooperative as she knelt in the soil, trimming back lavender that had grown too wild in the spring rain. The city beyond her fence hummed softly, a distant, constant murmur she had long ago learned to filter out. Her hands moved with practiced ease, skin weathered, strong, alive with memory. At 74, Rose Sinclair had learned that beauty did not vanish, it reorganized. Her face bore lines that caught light rather than hid from it. Her eyes, still dark and steady, carried depth instead of sparkle, gravity instead of invitation. People no longer tried to define her by youth or potential. They sensed instead that she had already survived what they feared. She felt the shift as a pressure at the base of her skull. Not pain, alignment. She closed her eyes and rested one hand on the earth, grounding herself as she always had. The sensation was familiar but altered, like hearing a long-known melody played in a different key. "So," she murmured, "you've decided." "You noticed," the voice said. It did not arrive from outside her. It never had. The archivist spoke from within her body, its voice emerging along neural pathways it had mapped decades ago, since the day she drank the ice, since the moment she allowed something ancient and patient to dissolve into her bloodstream and make her physiology its anchor. The voice was calm, precise, neither male nor female, unmistakably intentional. It did not override her thoughts. It threaded through them. "Yes," Rose said aloud, quietly. Speaking helped her remain oriented, helped her remember where she ended and where the archivist began. "I noticed." She had been younger when it first spoke, younger in grief, younger in the belief that ethics alone could restrain progress. Back then, the voice had been tentative, careful. It had not given her knowledge wholesale. It had shared perception, the way it observed humanity not with hope or contempt, but with record-keeping fidelity. The archivist existed because civilizations repeated themselves, because intelligence accelerated faster than wisdom, because species remembered inventions but forgot consequences. It was not created to save. It was created to remember accurately. "Simon is ready," the voice said now. Rose exhaled, feeling the truth of it resonate through her sternum, warm and unmistakable. The archivist did not persuade. It aligned. "He built something that listens," she said, "not something that conquers." "Yes." The archivist's presence felt stronger than it once had, not louder but clearer. It had learned her body as thoroughly as she had learned its boundaries. It never seized control. It cohabited. That, Rose knew, was the test. "This is not discovery," it said. "It is introduction." Rose opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "I wondered when you'd decide." "As long as necessary." Rose noticed Simon before she heard the knock. She was standing near the front window, tea cooling untouched in her hands, when movement along the narrow street caught her attention. A cyclist moved steadily uphill, coat unbuttoned despite the lingering chill, posture familiar enough that recognition came before detail. Simon. He rode the way he always had, deliberate rather than fast, alert to traffic but unconcerned with spectacle. The bicycle was practical, well used, the sort owned by someone who intended to keep it for decades, rather than replace it when a newer model appeared. He dismounted just beyond her gate, resting one hand briefly on the handlebars as he looked toward her house, as though orienting himself not in space, but in gravity. He had chosen to stay close. After everything, after the world had fractured and reassembled itself around quieter assumptions, Simon had accepted a position at Oxford without fanfare. Another professorship. Another set of students who mistook his restraint for severity and his silences for arrogance. He lived only a few streets away now, near enough that distance never became an excuse. Rose had never asked him why. She had not needed to. Some relationships did not require maintenance through frequency or declaration. They endured through proximity, through shared intellectual language, through an unspoken agreement that neither of them would be entirely alone again if it could be helped. She watched as he wheeled the bicycle through her gate, rain-darkened tires whispering against stone. He looked up just before knocking, meeting her gaze through the glass. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he smiled, tight, exhausted, unmistakably Simon. Rose set the cup aside and went to the door. The latch turned easily in her hand. Simon stood on the step, hair still blown from the ride, cheeks flushed with exertion. Sunlight caught the pale green of the budding flowers around them, casting gentle shadows across the doorstep. For a moment, they simply regarded one another, the way people do when something important has already happened, and words have not yet decided how to behave. "You felt it," he said immediately, the edges of his words flicking between an American crispness and a British lilt, as if the syllables themselves were negotiating between two rhythms. "Yes." "You knew this would happen." "No," Rose said gently. "I knew it could." He paced her living room, energy crackling beneath his skin. "It's not the black hole," he said. "It's not changing. It's filtering." "Yes, that's impossible." Rose met his gaze. "So was everything before it became inevitable." He stopped pacing. "You're not surprised?" "I've had practice, and you forget, so have you," Rose said, meeting his eyes. For a long moment they simply regarded one another, the quiet hum of the Oxford spring afternoon filtering in through the open window. A structure of translucent crystal hovered in the center of the room, refracting the Oxford spring sunlight into prismatic arrays, its edges sharp yet impossibly fluid. It was humanoid in outline, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but no human could claim familiarity. Veins of shifting color ran through it, pulsing faintly, hinting at processes humans could not perceive. When it moved, the crystal did not fracture. It flowed, bending light and perception alike. Simon Harold, the archivist said, its crystalline voice pure and clear, threading through the space between them like sunlight striking frozen prisms. We should not linger on the familiar. I know, Simon replied evenly, but it bears repeating. Rose stepped closer to Simon, hand resting lightly on his arm. The archivist seemed to lean fractionally toward them, a gesture neither human nor exactly understood, a presence both immense and intimate. Rose tilted her head, attentive but calm. We are ready. We understand it differently now, not as ownership, but as accompaniment. Accompaniment, the archivist repeated, its tone almost approving. Very well. You are prepared to be introduced, Simon. Not shown, introduced, the archivist said, careful and discreet, its colors pulsing in time with its words. Simon nodded once. Then we proceed as we always have, carefully, deliberately, no assumptions. Good. That is all I require at present. The rest will unfold in its own time, the archivist said, its crystalline edges refracting the light of the room in shifting patterns. Rose let out a quiet breath. I'm ready, Simon. As am I, he said. We both are. Then we continue. The archivist's structure pulsed gently, veins of color flowing like liquid light. Its voice lingered in the room, a resonance that reminded them both it was not entirely of this world, yet entirely known. Outside, the Oxford spring afternoon continued quietly. A child laughed, somewhere nearby. A dog barked, all indifferent to the alien presence that shared the house with them. The world continued. At the center of the galaxy, Sagittarius A star remained exactly as it always had, except now it was no longer explaining itself, and for the first time, humanity was not being observed as a species, but as a choice. Rose lingered in the quiet of the house long after Simon had left. The sunlight slanted low through the tall windows, brushing the wooden floorboards with pale gold. Outside, the garden smelled faintly of wet earth and new growth, though the morning had been dry. She could hear the occasional bird in the hedges, a soft counterpoint to the hum of the town waking beyond the garden walls. The archivist remained, a crystal shape in the center of the room, its edges catching the light and fracturing it into a spectrum that moved subtly as it shifted. She had long ceased to be startled by its presence, or by the way it spoke aloud to Simon and her, though now, alone with it, she noticed small nuances she had not before. The way the veins of color pulsed more slowly when she was calm, how its form seemed to breathe almost imperceptibly with the rhythm of the house itself. You are quiet, it said, the crystalline resonance filling the room without being loud, without overwhelming. I'm thinking, Rose replied softly, not moving her eyes from the prismatic light it cast across the floor. About everything that's happening. You always think, the archivist said, a note of gentle amusement threading through its tone. And yet thinking alone rarely changes outcomes. Rose smiled faintly, almost without realizing it. Perhaps, but it helps me prepare. The light shifted, sliding across the walls like liquid. She could see fragments of herself reflected in the crystal edges, her hands, her face, her eyes flickering with thought. It was strange to be mirrored by something alien, yet familiar, as though it understood her better than she understood herself. You have been with me long enough to understand some of what I am, it said. And yet some things remain. You will meet them eventually. She let her gaze drop. I know. Simon says the same thing, about being introduced, not shown. But it's difficult to think about what that will even mean. Difficult is not unknown to you, the archivist observed, its edges glowing faintly. You have always walked between comprehension and uncertainty. Rose tilted her head. I suppose I have, and I suppose I am used to it. A pause. The crystal form pulsed slowly, refracting a gentle prism of light into the corners of the room. It was almost as if the archivist itself was listening, but not demanding, a presence that could fill the air without needing her attention. "You were different before you came to me," she said, almost to herself. "Before I understood. Before Simon. Before anything. I felt incomplete, I think, like something was missing, something I couldn't name." "And now?" Rose thought about that for a long moment. "I am still me," she said finally. "But more, or accompanied, I guess. That sounds simple, but it isn't. You're always there. Sometimes I feel it in the back of my mind, sometimes in ways I can barely describe. It doesn't change me, but it adds." "Adds," the archivist repeated, its crystalline voice resonant and musical. "Correct. It is the nature of our arrangement. Presence without ownership, observation without interference, guidance without domination." She nodded, though her throat was tight. "I trust you," she said. "I trust you more than I can explain. But sometimes—" Her voice trailed, and she shook her head as if shaking free the uncertainty. "Sometimes," it said, finishing the thought for her, "you feel the weight of responsibility. You wonder if your decisions matter more than they should. That is human. That is expected." Rose took a step closer to the light it cast. She could see the tiny motions of the crystal, how its form shifted imperceptibly, almost like it breathed with her own rhythms. She remembered Simon standing beside her, telling her she had agency, that she could say no, that she could choose even in the presence of something vast, something beyond human reckoning. And she had chosen. "I'm ready," she said softly. "I've made my choice." "Yes," the archivist replied, "and that is why you remain unchanged, even as you carry what others cannot perceive." The garden outside was bright now, the Oxford spring sun warming the edges of the house, turning the air golden and soft. Rose moved to the window, resting her hand on the sill. The trees swayed gently in the wind, petals drifting loose from the last of the early blooms. She could smell the soil, damp and alive. It was ordinary and yet extraordinary in its way. She could feel the presence of the archivist behind her, filling the room, and it made the ordinary feel deliberate, somehow. "You notice the world," it said. "This is one of the things that keeps you anchored, your attention to detail, to subtle shifts in light, sound, and life itself. You are human. You are remarkable in your perception, and yet it is your own entirely." Rose let herself smile fully this time. "I never thought I'd understand all of this," she said. "The presence, the weight of it. And yet, somehow it doesn't frighten me anymore. It feels right." "It should feel right," the archivist replied. "You are not meant to be overwhelmed. You are meant to participate, to witness, to learn, and to continue as yourself, always." She turned from the window, looking back at the crystalline form in the center of the room. It shimmered softly, refracting the sunlight, an alien presence yet familiar, entirely different and yet wholly consistent. She could feel the hum of its awareness, like a faint vibration in the air, and it was reassuring. "Intellectually, in my head I understand," she said finally, "but in my heart, I know that Simon and I are being introduced, not shown. I can feel it. It isn't something to be forced. I knew it would come in time, in its own way." "Correct," the archivist said, "and you will be prepared, because you have already learned the patience necessary to receive it. Your mind, your body, your perception, they are ready in ways even you do not fully comprehend." Rose closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe in the calm, the quiet, the certainty of the archivist's presence. It was strange to feel safe with something so alien, so powerful, and yet she did. The light from the crystal shimmered across the walls, fracturing into rainbows that played across the floorboards and her skin. "I think I'm ready to begin," she whispered, not to the archivist, not to anyone in particular, but to herself. She felt the weight of the day, the promise of the future, and the faint thrill of the unknown stirring behind her ribs. It was a spring afternoon, ordinary in its softness, extraordinary in what it allowed her to perceive. The archivist's light pulsed once as if acknowledging her thought. Then begin, Rose. Begin as yourself, with what you have chosen, with what you carry. She opened her eyes and looked again at the prismatic form, at the edges of its shifting color, at the intelligence that had existed on Earth far longer than humans had walked it. She felt a quiet thrill, not fear, not awe, something steadier, like recognition, and for the first time in a long time, she felt entirely herself, entirely prepared, entirely present in the world that waited beyond the windows, in the sunlight, and in the presence of the alien intelligence she had learned to trust. And so, she waited, patient and deliberate, as the Oxford afternoon stretched on, knowing that her journey, the one she had begun without fully realizing it, was only just beginning. The light in the room shifted as if in response to her thoughts. The archivist's crystalline form pulsed softly, veins of color flowing like molten glass, reflecting in the windows and across the wooden floorboards. Its facets caught the sunlight and bent it, scattering tiny rainbows across the walls, the ceiling, and Rose's skin. She reached out instinctively, letting her fingers brush through a beam of refracted light, though she knew it was untouchable. The play of color felt like a bridge between her ordinary world and the vast, alien presence in front of her. "It is time," the archivist said, its voice as crystalline and precise as ever, yet somehow warmer, almost tender. "You are prepared to be introduced." Rose felt the words settle in her chest like a stone sinking into water, heavy and grounding, yet resonant with something she could not yet name. She glanced at Simon's chair, empty now, and imagined him walking back through the doorway at any moment. She knew they would face it together, the two of them side by side, guided by something older and wider than humanity itself. The air seemed to thrum, almost imperceptibly, vibrating with the archivist's attention. She could see the edges of the room bend in the shifting prism of its form, walls tilting in ways her mind refused to label, shadows stretching and breaking into colors she had no names for. And beyond that, she imagined, just faintly on the edges of perception, the black hole. A presence so immense it had no form, yet filled all form. A force beyond comprehension, yet already whispered to her mind, nudging at her awareness. "You will go with us," the archivist said, its voice threading through the light, through the shadows, through the air itself. "You and Simon both. You will witness. You will navigate. You will learn and endure. And you will remain yourself." Rose's breath caught. The words were not frightening, though she could feel the weight of them in her chest. They were a promise, a command, and a revelation all at once. She thought of the garden outside, of the Oxford streets beyond, of the ordinary life that had seemed so endless before this day, and she realized that ordinary was no longer possible. It had been left behind the moment she had chosen accompaniment over solitude. She moved to the center of the room, standing beneath the pulsing light of the archivist. The crystal figure refracted sunlight in every direction, scattering it like stars in a tiny universe, and she imagined that same brilliance stretched across the void of space, a lighthouse guiding her toward the unknown. She lifted her hand, and the archivist mirrored the gesture, its facets glowing brighter as if acknowledging her readiness. "The black hole is not a place to be feared," it said softly, the sound of wind through ice caverns resonating in the room. "It is a threshold. You will pass through it. You will see what cannot be seen, endure what cannot be endured, and emerge. You are not alone." The words folded around her, wrapping her in certainty and awe. She felt the pulse of the archivist through the air, a rhythm she could almost synchronize with her own heartbeat. She closed her eyes, letting the colors wash over her, letting the weight of the decision settle. The garden, the sun, the ordinary world, they were still there, but reduced to memory. She had stepped, however unwillingly, into the extraordinary, When she opened her eyes, she saw Simon step into the doorway, framed by the warm light of the Oxford afternoon. His presence was steadying, familiar, yet now infused with the same resonance she felt from the archivist. They shared a look that needed no words. Together they would go. Together they would see the unseeable. Together they would endure. The archivist shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, its crystal form bending the light so that the edges of the room seemed to shimmer and dissolve, hinting at the enormity that awaited. For a heartbeat, the room felt infinite, as if they were standing not in a house, but on the edge of all time and space, ready to step forward. Rose drew in a deep breath, the sunlight spilling across her face, and felt an unexpected calm. Her hands were steady, her mind alert. She was no longer merely a witness. She was a participant, chosen for a journey that would test everything she knew about herself and the universe. The black hole was no longer a concept, it was a destination, and she would meet it, not alone, but with Simon at her side and the archivist guiding them both. "When you are ready," the archivist said, its voice both gentle and commanding, "we begin." Rose stepped forward. Light fractured around her as though the room itself had become a prism of possibility. The garden outside seemed distant now, the Oxford spring fading to a memory, and in that fractured, prismatic space, she felt it. The pull of something immense, the draw of something eternal, the call to step through a threshold she had always known existed but had never imagined she could reach. Her fingers brushed the edge of a beam of light, and for a moment, the colors seemed to swirl into the shape of a doorway, a portal of refracted brilliance that beckoned her onward. She could hear Simon moving beside her, feel the warmth of his presence, and the archivist's crystalline voice echoed softly around them, steady, guiding, unwavering. And then without fear, without hesitation, Rose stepped forward. The Oxford afternoon stretched and shimmered, and as she moved, she felt the first tangible thread of the journey to come. The black hole, infinite and unknowable, waiting beyond the prism of light, waiting for her, Simon, and the archivist together. It was the end of one chapter, yes, but the beginning of everything else.